All right, let's talk about something that affects millions of people but is still, kind of shrouded in mystery: male infertility. For this explainer, we're going straight to the top, to the brand new global guidelines from the World Health Organization to really understand what's going on. So, let's dive right in. So, be honest, when you hear the word infertility, who immediately comes to mind? For so long, the whole conversation has really focused on women. But what the WHO is showing us with their latest data, well, it completely flips that script and asks us to look at a much bigger picture. And just how big is that picture? Well, the number that the WHO has landed on is pretty staggering. We're talking about 17.5% of the entire adult population around the world.
That's right, let that sink in for a second. Nearly 1 out of every 6 adults. And what's really striking is that this isn't just a problem for one part of the world or one economic group. It's basically the same whether you're in a high, middle, or low-income country. It is a truly universal human experience.
Okay, so now let's zoom in and focus on the male side of this equation. What is actually going on? What are the root causes? Well, this is where things start to get a little bit complicated. You know what's so powerful here is just how upfront the WHO is. They come right out and say, look, we just don't know as much about male infertility. That highlights a massive challenge for doctors and patients, because a lot of the time, the hardest part of the whole journey is just figuring out why it's happening. So let's actually break down what we do know. This chart gives us a pretty good sense of things. You can see some of the known causes, right? There's varicocele, which is basically enlarged veins in the scrotum. That's about 15%. Testicular failure, about 11%. Infections, around 7%. But then, your eye goes straight to that huge purple slice, doesn't it? Yeah, nearly half. For almost 1 out of every 2 men who are dealing with infertility, doctors just can't pinpoint a specific reason. It's officially labeled unexplained. And that right there is exactly why these new WHO guidelines are such a game changer. They're trying to create a standard process for a very uncertain field.
So with all that uncertainty, where do you even begin? Well, this is where the WHO steps in with a really clear, step-by-step roadmap for diagnosis. The goal is to make this process consistent and effective for everybody, no matter where you are in the world.
It all really comes down to a 3-step foundation. It kicks off with a really deep dive into your medical history. Everything. Then you move on to a thorough physical exam. And finally, the cornerstone of the whole thing, a semen analysis. And notice that little detail at the end? If the results look off, the WHO says you absolutely have to repeat the test to be sure. No jumping to conclusions.
So what happens after a diagnosis is made? Or even if the diagnosis is simply unexplained? What are the next steps? Well, the guidelines lay out some really clear pathways to care, and they start with things that are often in our own hands.
The WHO really shines a spotlight on these 4 key areas. Things like your diet, how much you exercise, alcohol, and smoking. Now, they're not saying any of these are a magic fix, but they are all recognized as big factors that can impact your overall health, and that, of course, includes your fertility.
And this part, I think, is just so important. The guideline puts a huge emphasis on empathy. This is not about blaming someone for what they eat or for their habits. It's about giving them supportive, non-judgmental information so they feel empowered to make the best choices they can.
Okay, let's circle back to that pie chart of causes we saw earlier. Remember that 15% slice for varicocele? This is a really big deal because, unlike so many of the other causes, this one is often correctable. For a pretty significant group of men, this represents a clear path forward.
So what does treatment actually look like? Well, there are 2 main options. There's a surgical route to tie off those veins, or there's a less invasive radiological procedure called embolization that blocks them off. And you know what the WHO found when they looked at all the evidence? The outcomes are basically the same. There are only trivial differences, which is fantastic news. It gives patients and doctors real flexibility to choose the best option.
So, we've walked through the science, the diagnosis, and the treatments. But the WHO guideline doesn't just stop there. It takes the whole conversation to another level, framing fertility care not as some kind of luxury, but as a fundamental part of our health. I mean, that is just such a powerful statement. The WHO is making the case that because infertility affects our mental, our social, and our physical well-being so deeply, providing care for it is absolutely essential to upholding a person's basic right to health. This all points to a much bigger vision,
right? It's about weaving fertility services into our everyday healthcare systems. It's about promoting gender equality by finally making men a central part of the conversation. And maybe the most important piece of all, making sure these services are actually accessible and affordable for everyone.
So really, the crucial takeaway here isn't just about understanding the biology. What the WHO guideline is really doing is pushing us all to ask a much bigger question. It's a challenge, not just to policymakers and healthcare systems, but to all of us. How can we start breaking down these barriers to make sure that absolutely everyone has the opportunity to build the family they want? What's our role in making that a reality?